Dr. William Roulston is renowned as a historian and an expert in the history and heritage of Ulster.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you tonight, a privilege that I have the opportunity to speak. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It is wonderful to see so many people packed into this room. And thank you for your kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak tonight on the subject of the Hamiltons of Baronscourt, but also to be able to support the work of local historians and those who are trying to preserve the history of this area, and looking at that history and telling its story and proclaiming it to as wide an audience as possible. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. So I'm going to be taking you on a journey that begins in Scotland and comes through to the present day. The first part of my talk will look at the story of the Hamiltons, how they came to be here, something of their background in Scotland. And the second part is going to be focused more on the records of the estate and what those records can tell us about the families that have farmed here for generations. So to begin with then, the story of the Hamiltons of Baronscourt. Well, to really understand that story fully, we need to go back to Scotland in the 16th century. A period of considerable turmoil in many ways, a period of deep change in many regards. And right at the centre of all that was happening in Scotland were the Hamiltons, then of basically Lanarkshire and Paisley in Scotland. So the gentleman on the left of the screen is the Earl of Arran, the second Earl of Arran, a very prominent nobleman in mid-16th century Scotland. He was actually the regent of Scotland during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots. When she was still a minor, the second Earl of Arran was the regent of Scotland. So a very, very powerful individual. Now, the support of the Hamiltons for Mary Queen of Scots did bring them into conflict. There were civil wars in Scotland in the 1560s and 70s. The Hamiltons, because of their support for Mary Queen of Scots, were against those who were trying to ensure that Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, remained on the throne. At times, life was rather difficult for the family. Sometimes they were on the run. Sometimes they were caught up in battles. Sometimes they had to withdraw into exile in France, to France and even to England. Now, the Earl of Arran had several sons. A younger son, one of his younger sons, was Claude, the gentleman on the right of the screen. Lord Claude Hamilton was born about 1546. Again, was right at the forefront of the Hamilton support for Mary Queen of Scots. He himself was involved in battle, in conflict, and he himself his own life was in danger at different times. Now, as a boy, probably only 7 years old, he was placed in possession of the lands of Paisley Abbey near Glasgow in Scotland. So here is the place of Paisley in Scotland. That's correct. It's not the palace. It is the place of Paisley. And just here we have St. Mirren's Isle and Paisley Abbey. St. Mirren's Isle was where the family buried in Scotland. So in 1553, as I said, when Claude was just a boy, Claude was granted the lands of Paisley. Actually, he was granted those lands by Pope Leo III, Julius III, granted him those lands. And that papal bull, that vellum document written in Latin, still survives today at Baronscourt. And it's a remarkable document. In many ways, you could call it almost the family's title deed, because it was the beginning of the landed possessions of this particular branch of the Hamilton family. So this was the home of the Hamiltons in Scotland, and this was where, if not here, then somewhere in this district, was born a boy who would grow up to become the first Earl of Abercorn. So Lord Claude Hamilton had several sons. The eldest of those sons, James Hamilton, became Earl of Abercorn in 1606, the first Earl of Abercorn. And he was very much part of the Scottish royal court. By this time, the differences between the Hamiltons and James VI of Scotland had been resolved, and the first Earl of Abercorn was very much part of that kingly circle. So that when, in 1610, the scheme for the plantation of Ulster was introduced, the king himself singled out the first Earl of Abercorn as someone that he wanted to be centrally involved in delivering the plantation scheme. So if I just show you a map of plantation Ulster. So only 6 of Ulster's 9 counties were part of the official scheme of plantation. The official scheme of plantation did not concern Antrim, Down or Monaghan. The red areas on the map were granted to English undertakers because of the great undertaking that they were about to embark on. The blue areas were granted to Scottish undertakers. Lowland Scots, chief of whom was the Earl of Abercorn. And right almost in the centre of the planted counties is the barony of Strabane, where we are now. And the chief undertaker in that barony was the Earl of Abercorn. Now, prior to the plantation, in fact, to help to divide up the lands of Ulster among the grantees, a series of maps were prepared under the direction of Sir Josias Bodley, really a military engineer, but someone who was appointed to map out plantation Ulster. And Bodley and his team visited different districts, gathered together the knowledgeable local people, recorded the information about the townlands in those respective areas, and then prepared these beautifully drawn maps, mapping out the network of townlands across the planted counties. So this is one of the maps of the barony of Strabane. So just here we have Newton Stewart. Here we have Strabane. Over here is Lifford. At this time, Lifford was a much larger place than Strabane. Up here we have the fort and the castle of Omagh, or Omagh. Let me zoom in a bit more on this particular area here, because we can see here, well, there's Newton Stewart, the castle, or Newton as it was before the Stuarts arrived in the early 17th century. And here we have the loch in the centre, a little island, and a castle on that island. Now, you'll still recognise some of the townlands today, I'm sure, if you're from this particular area. There's, for example, Enva. We've got Letterbin over here, for example. We've got Lislafferty, for instance. We've got Callaghy, and so on and so forth. So many of the townland names we see on these maps are still readily recognisable today. So this is really where we are right now, in the vicinity of this lake with this island. Now that island is, of course, Island MacHugh. It was a prehistoric crannog. It was a kingly centre thousands of years ago. In the medieval period, a stone castle was built on the island. So it's been a place of, you might say, settlement over thousands of years. And here we see today. Now today it's tree covered, but within the trees there are still the remains of a stone castle. Island MacHugh Castle. So this was a place, as I said, which had a settlement history going back millennia and a place of continued importance through the generations over the centuries. And so it's not really surprising that after the plantation period, it continued to be a place of considerable importance. You tend to find places that are of considerable importance in more recent times tend to be based on the sites of places of importance thousands of years ago. Okay, so this map shows you the network of Hamilton estates or manors as created in the early 17th century. So first of all, the first Earl of Abercorn received the manor of Dunlop, where I come from, up at Brady, and the manor of Strabane. So really between Strabane, Sion Mills, both sides of the River Mourne. The first Earl's brother was Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw. And not Greenlaw on the Scottish borders. There's actually a Greenlaw near Paisley in Scotland. But place names migrate. And so just outside the village of Ballinagorry, there is a townland called Greenlaw. So Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw received the manor of Clohogle. This area, Derry Woon, where we are now. Derry Woon was originally granted to another George Hamilton, a George Hamilton of Binning in Scotland, who, though he claimed to be a brother of George Hamilton of Greenlaw, that seems rather unlikely. You'd have two Georges in the same family. But anyway, George Hamilton of Binning was the original grantee of the lands in the manor of Derry Woon. But he sold out at a fairly early stage, and it was Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw who also purchased this manor. So we think first Earl had Dunlop and Strabane, Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw had Clohogle and Derry Woon. And at Derry Woon, probably about a mile north of where we are now, Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw built this castle, Derry Woon Castle. More of a fortified house than a castle. Look, for example, at the very large doors and windows in it, but still fortified to some extent. It could be defended against attack. It was an L-shaped building, so you think of it going, one L goes like that, another comes out like that, and at the angle of the L, we have this lovely corbelled, turreted staircase projecting out from the inner wall. And that corbelling, that moulded corbelling, was very much a distinctive feature of castles built by the Scots in early 17th century Ulster. You can find it, for example, if you're familiar with Ballygally Castle on the Antrim coast, you'll see it there. You'll see it in other castles built by the Scots in the plantation period. So this was built around about 1622. It was intended to be the home of Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw. Now, two things characterised the story of the family in the 17th century. One was their support for the royalist cause. The other was their adherence to Catholicism. So Sir George Hamilton of Greenlaw was a devout Catholic. When the first Earl of Abercorn died as a fairly young man, he was placed in charge of the first Earl's children and raised them as Catholics. Because of their support for both royalism and Catholicism, they frequently ended up, you might say, on the losing side during the wars of the 17th century. So in the 1650s, when the Cromwellians were in power, the Hamiltons' lands were confiscated because of their adherence to the royalist cause. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, the Hamiltons got their lands back. That was okay for about 28 years or so, until we come to the period of the Siege of Derry and the Battle of the Boyne. By this stage, the head of the family is the fourth Earl of Abercorn. He was a very strong supporter of King James, a firm Jacobite. Whenever James II arrived in Ireland, and came up to inspect the siege at Derry in 1689, the 4th Earl of Abercorn was with him. In fact, the 4th Earl of Abercorn was sent up to the walls to talk to those defending the city, to encourage them to surrender. He was not successful. He was reputedly horrified to see so many of his own tenants inside the walls defending the city. He was probably even more shocked to see that one of the leading defenders inside the city was his own cousin, James Hamilton, another James Hamilton. Now, the 4th Earl of Abercorn was killed when the ship taking him from Ireland to France was attacked by a Dutch privateer in the English Channel. The 4th Earl was mortally wounded. His body was brought ashore at London, and he was buried there. He died without heir, so the title and the estate passed to his brother, Charles, who became 5th Earl of Abercorn. Charles died without heir in 1701, and so the title and the estate passed to a cousin, James Hamilton, the same James Hamilton who had been inside the walls of Derry in 1689. So you have one family, members outside the walls with King James, others inside the walls defending the city, which just makes it all the more interesting and wonderful how complex family histories can be. In fact, one of the leading generals in King James's army was Richard Hamilton, General Richard Hamilton, a son of, an uncle, in fact, of this man. So again, there you have an uncle and nephew, as well as cousins and second cousins, and so on and so forth. Now, the 6th Earl of Abercorn was a very important figure in the family story, because under him, the disparate parts of the estate now coalesced into one single property. So he owns not only the manors of Dunalong and Strabane, he also owned the manors of Lahole and Derrywoon. And through his mother's family, he acquired another extensive property in County Donegal, the manors of McGavelin and Lismockery. So this is now one single estate, no longer several parts, but now one single estate. So it is a complex story in the 17th century. They're given the lands in 1610. They're confiscated in the 1650s. They get them back in 1660. They're confiscated again after the Battle of the Boyne by King William, but they get them back. They're confiscated again when the English Parliament passes a law cancelling all of King William's land grants, but they get them back again in 1701. Okay? It is a complicated story. I can't present it any more simply than that. Yes. But the fact is, they survived. They came through that period, they survived, and from the 18th century onwards, there was remarkable stability in the ownership of the estate from one generation to the next. And one of the key figures in, you might say, consolidating the property, developing it, bringing it together, was this man, the 8th Earl of Abercorn, a grandson of the man I've just shown you, the 6th Earl. And the 8th Earl was a very quiet, reserved individual. He was mocked cruelly for it, but he was a very compassionate. He was deeply interested in his estate. He was sympathetic to the needs of his tenants. And although he was an absentee, although he lived most of his life in London and in Essex and in Edinburgh, he knew the estate inside out. Every week he wrote to his agents, and every week they wrote back to him. And I'll show you some examples of letters later on. But he was he was a remarkable individual. He was Earl for a period of 45 years. And when you read his letters, you realize this guy really did know what was going on. He's no aloof aristocrat who doesn't care and just wants to live the high life. No, he did care. He did care, and he understood what was going on. Now, under him, the building we see now, on this slide, was completed, was actually begun by his father, the 7th Earl, but completed by the 8th Earl. And this is the building known as the Agent's House. Now, it's a lovely Palladian villa. There's a lovely portico, brick built, originally 2 stories in height, but later reduced to 1. And this was the home of the 8th Earl whenever he came to visit his estate. However, in July 1776, the 8th Earl began building a new house. The house just below us here, today's BARONSCOURT Castle. And it was completed in 1783, and it was built under the patronage of the 8th Earl of Abercorn. Now, the 8th Earl died in 1789, and he was succeeded by his nephew. The 8th Earl wasn't married, no children, and so when he died, the estate passed to his nephew, the 1st Marquess of Abercorn. And the 1st Marquess was a man of very different stamp. The 1st Marquess was very outgoing, engaging, gregarious, politically ambitious in a way that the 8th Earl was not. The 8th Earl had no real political ambitions in Ireland. The 1st Marquess, on the other hand, was politically ambitious in Ireland. Now, he actually succeeded as the 9th Earl of Abercorn. But in 1790, he became the 1st Marquess of Abercorn. So he was elevated one position in the peerage. Now, the 1st Marquess brought in the famous London architect Sir John Soane to really recast Baronscourt. And that's what Soane did. He developed the house. He extended it. He actually turned it back to front. So what had been the front door became the back door, and what had been the back door became the front door. But unfortunately, that house suffered a severe fire in 1796, which really left it gutted. We have this drawing before the fire, which shows it in its grandeur. But tragically, the house was badly damaged in that fire in 1796. It was for a time patched up, but it never quite recovered its glory that it had been under Soane. Now, it remained as such. Really, it was the centre part of the house that was burnt out in particular. It remained in that condition until the 1st Marquess's grandson. The first Marquess had a son. In fact, he had 2 sons who predeceased him. And so when the 1st Marquess died in 1818, the title and the estate passed to his grandson, who was only a 7-year-old boy when he inherited the title and the estate. And so it was not until 1832 that he reached majority and began to run the estate in his own name. Now, in the 1830s, now an adult, the 1st Marquess brought in a father and son team of architects, Richard and William Vitruvius Morrison, 2 architects at the height of their powers in Ireland in the 1830s. And under the Morrisons, Baronscourt reached its zenith in terms of its scale and splendour. So the house was really given a complete refurbishment, a complete makeover. And so we have this wonderful portico, for example, jutting out from the front of the house. Excuse me. At one time, there were 2 sweeping wings reaching out from either end of the front of the house as well. But in 1940, one of those was burnt out in a fire. And then after the war, they demolished that wing, and they also demolished the wing on this side to add balance to the front of the house, so the house would retain a balance on the front of it. And the Morrisons really left their stamp on the house in a very major way. So the house today is essentially the house as left by the Morrisons in the 1830s. Now, other features of the estate can also be dated to the period of the second Marquess, who in 1868 became the first Duke of Abercorn. He was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and he became first Duke, as I said, in 1868. In the 1850s, Baronscourt Church was constructed. And this is still the church that we see today, and this is still very much the family's church. There are many memorials to the family inside it. One of the most amazing memorials is one to the first Duchess of Abercorn. The first Duke and Duchess had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. By the time the first Duchess died in 1905, she had more than 250 direct descendants. Now, the first Duke died in 1885, and he's buried, as are other family members, up here at Baronscourt. A magnificent Celtic cross stands over his grave. He was succeeded by his son, the second Duke, and under his direction, the stable block, where we are right now, was built in 1890 in a very distinctive Scottish baronial style. So whereas earlier buildings built in a very distinctly classical style, neoclassicism, by this stage the fashion was to build in the Scottish baronial style. So we see the crow-stepped gables and dormers. We also see some corbelling on the central tower, for instance. So if you had a chance, look up, you'll see some of the details from that. So this, as I said, was completed about 1890. And one final building I want to show you is very much testimony to the commitment the family continues to have to Baronscourt. And in particular, it reflects the commitment of the late Duchess of Abercorn, Sasha, the Duchess of Abercorn, who back over 30 years ago established the Pushkin Trust, the Pushkin Prize and Pushkin Trust. One of her ancestors was the Russian author Alexander Pushkin. And the Duchess was fascinated by his poetry and saw through that a way of making an impact on school children across this island. So to encourage creative writing among school children. That was through the work, and it continues through the work of the Pushkin Trust. And thousands of teachers and thousands of schools and tens of thousands of children have been involved in the Pushkin Trust. Some 80,000 or so children have been involved in this project across the island, across political and religious and social divides. And it's something that has made a tremendous impact and continues to make a tremendous impact. And as a base for the work of the Pushkin Trust, this beautiful house, built entirely of larchwood, was constructed, designed by Richard Pierce, and in the style of a Russian dacha. And that is one of the more recent and one of the most striking features of the architectural history of Baronscourt. So what then survives of the family papers that can help us understand more about the people who have lived here over the generations and the tenants on the estate? Well, the main archive of family papers is in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, Proney in Titanic Quarter in Belfast. The reference is D623, which indicates that the earliest records were deposited in Proney probably back in the 1920s or even 1930s. Proney opened its doors in 1924. And in the Abercorn papers, there are nearly 30,000 individually numbered records, documents. There are 759 volumes, 88 bundles, and 40 prony boxes. And it says one of the best ways of conveying an impression of the size of the archive is to say it runs to 168 boxes, 9 yards of volumes, too large to be accommodated in a box, and 6 map drawers of other outsize material. So you think of it, over 30,000 individually itemized documents. And much of that cataloguing was carried out by Dr. Anthony Malcolmson, the very distinguished archivist who was head of Prony from 1987 to 1997. You notice that the collection runs from 1219 to 1963. 1219, that's, well, 805 years ago now. And in fact, the oldest document in the archive is this papal bull of 1219. It's not actually connected to the Hamilton family, but it concerns the Abbey of Paisley. Hence, it is within the family papers in Prony. And you think this document is over 800 years old, and it is in a remarkable state of preservation. The ink is so clear, the handwriting perfectly legible. It is really quite remarkable how it has survived for so long. Now, one of the things I mentioned in the Abercorn papers is the really excellent correspondence between the 8th Earl of Abercorn and his agents. So, as I've said, the 8th Earl lived mainly in England and Scotland, but wrote every week to his agents. And he'd maybe 4 or 5 agents at different times on the estate who were writing back to him. The Abercorn correspondence of the 18th century is probably the best set of estate correspondence anywhere in Britain and Ireland. It is truly astonishing for its scope, its voluminity, and its content. So let me just show you a few examples. I've picked out a few of these. Here's a letter from James Hamilton, who's the agent to the Earl of Abercorn, from July 1772. William Galbraith of Whitehouse, well, that's a townland around here, isn't it? Those of you who live around this way. Manor of Derrygoon is dead. He left his farm to his 4 sons. 2 of them are less than 18. The widow and 2 eldest sons hold it and manage it. The eldest wants to dispose of his 4th or his quarter and go to America, and to leave the remainder to be managed by his mother and brother. The farm pays at present £24, 15 shillings. So there are various ways of looking at the correspondence, and various lessons you can draw out of it. It provides a window, for instance, into the story of emigration from this area, particularly in the 18th century when the correspondence is at its best. And other records of emigration are often very rare. So here we have a mention of a son of William Galbraith, who wants to sell his property or sell his interest in the property and go to America. And this is just one of many hundreds of letters referring to emigration. Let's take another one. This is from Nathaniel Nesbitt to the Earl of Abercorn from April 1770. Actually, that's an error on my part. It should be 1754, not 1774. Hood of Lower Lisnatinny sold his interest to turn innkeeper in Newton Stewart. The tenants on the land gave Devon the money that he was to give Hood, and I believe that affair is settled. I took part with neither side until your lordship pleasure was known, though applied to by squires on both sides. So again, there's somebody who's a tenant farmer, Hood, who now decides he wants to give up farming and run an inn in Newton Stewart. And of course, Hood is a name very much associated with Newton Stewart. Now to take this final one. And again, what can tell us little sidelights on local history. Again, this is from James Hamilton to the Earl of Abercorn, 1772, January 1772. We've had snow and some frost. On Friday night we had vast high wind, which was followed by great rain, that occasioned the greatest flood ever remembered here. There's an arch of a very considerable bridge at Dr. Palliser's at Newton, or near Newton Stewart. Palliser was the Church of Ireland's minister, rector at Newton Stewart. Bridge near Newton Stewart torn down. There has not been in 10 years so many great floods as has happened these last 5 months. So again, the impact of floods and weather conditions can also be found in the Abercorn letters. And one of the great strengths of the Abercorn, or in terms of accessibility of the Abercorn letters, is that you can read them on the Prony website. You see, back in the late 1960s, my old boss, Dr. Brian Traynor, was in Madrid at a conference. His wife's from Madrid, but I think he was in Madrid at a conference. And he was walking along a pavement, and he was hit by a car, and he was knocked onto the pavement, and his head struck the pavement, and he was very seriously injured. And he himself told a story that when he went to the doctor said that had he not had a thick skull, he would have been killed. As part of his recovery, and it took him a long time to recover from this, as part of his recovery, he went into the Prony in the mornings, and in the afternoons he went home, taking with him bundles of these letters, and he sat at home and dictated the letters into an old-fashioned dictaphone, which were then typed up by the copy typists in Prony. And these letters, thousands of them, can now be read online on the Prony website. So if you're interested in the history of this area, any aspect of it at all, get onto the Prony website and you can read these letters for yourself. Okay, now other documents you can find in the Abercorn collection are leases, the agreements between the landlord and the tenant. And I don't have one from the Newton Stewart area, but I do have one. This is our own lease. This is the lease for the Roulston farm at Gartavay. This is the farm that we still occupy to this day. And this dates from 1835. And it's a printed document with spaces left where in handwriting information can be added in. It's from the most noble James Marquis of Abercorn to Robert Roulston, who was my great-great-great-grandfather. And unfortunately, it's rather fragmentary today. It's in a very poor condition. But we have here Abercorn, the Marquis signing his name, John Humphrey, the agent signing his name, Major Humphrey, the father of Cecil Francis Alexander, the hymn writer. And then we have Robert Roulston, my 3 times great-grandfather, signing his name on this document. Now, the interesting thing about this document is that it turned up in a solicitor's office in Strabane 20 years ago. And my father was in the solicitors in some routine business, and the solicitor said, I've got this bundle of documents, would you like to take it away with you? And he said, yes, brought it home, and inside was the original lease for the farm from 1835, along with the original will of Robert Roulston, which is even more remarkable because if you know anything about Irish record keeping, you'll be aware that most original wills perished in Dublin in 1922 when the old Public Record Office went up in smoke. But within the Abercorn papers in Prony, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of leases just like this. And so you may find information about your ancestors who farmed in this area. There are also rent books, and here is an example of a rent book. This is a big, hefty tome, but this covers the period 1794 to 1809, this particular set of rent books. And these are organised by manor. So there'll be one of these for the manor of Strabane, for Dunalong, for Derrywoon, for the Donegal part of the estate as well. Just to show you a few things you can pick up in these rentals. Strabane Fields. Dennis Madden was the tenant. 1801. The agent has written into the rent book to set him out for America. To your son to set him out for America. £11, 18 shillings, 10.5 pence. So there's assistance being given to a tenant to allow his son to go to America. So again, the rent books can help us understand about demographic change in this area and processes of immigration. I mean, you think that's really big, and then the next line is to self to buy potatoes. So it goes from something that's going to have life-changing difference, make a life-changing difference to somebody's life, to something as mundane as buying potatoes, simply to support the family. Or for Derrywoon. This is for Ballyreenan and Largymore, and I'll show you a map of Ballyreenan and Largymore in a moment. Again, we come down to the bottom, and there's a note. The figure is £13, 13 shillings to pay his passage from America. It's interesting, to pay his passage from America. So there's a family member who wants to come back. And so we see the mention of that mentioned in the rental. And this particular rental is so useful because there are various loose sheets of paper just tucked into it at different points. Let me show you this. This is a loose sheet just inside that book I've just shown you. It's a list of the poor people in Derrywoon. So the townland and the name of the poor. Many of them widows, widow, cottier, widow, and so on. So you think, that's just a sheet of paper. At any point in the last 200 years, that could have been scrumpled up and thrown away as being of little importance. But it survives. It's there. And we learn from it about the poor, those in need, those who are obviously, the plan was to provide for them in some way, to give them assistance in some way, to give them food or whatever, to help them in their time of need. So it's amazing what survives that you could almost say isn't meant to survive, or you wouldn't expect it to survive, but tucked into a book, first drawn over 200 years ago. And here's another one. This is just tucked into that same rent book. It's a letter, or rather it's a memorandum, you could say. We, the undernamed persons, take this opportunity of informing your honour, that is the Marquis of Abercorn, that we have considered the affair between Matthew White and his mother, Widow White, as you desired us. And we think he is not doing her justice, and he is charging her with the running half year, and she has paid a year's rent for every year she held the place. We also think he has not done her justice in not drawing her turf according to his contract. And there we have the people who were appointed to deal with this. John Nealance and John White, presumably another member of the White family. And it's dated May the 21st, and that looks like 1808. So there's a row within a family. A son not treating his mother as he should have done. And we have a note of it recorded in the rent book. Really quite amazing what you can find. Now, I want to finish off with a number of slides looking at maps, because again, there are some wonderful maps in the Abercorn estate papers in Proning. So this is an amazing map. If this was rolled out, it wouldn't quite stretch the ceiling, but it would certainly go from the floor to above the height of the projector screen here. It's a map of the estate from 1804, mapping out every townland in the estate, from the Donegal bit to Donalong, Lahogel, Strabane to Derrywoon. Let me zoom in just a little bit more. And here we have the area around BARONSCOURT. So BARONSCOURT is just here where we are right now. This big block in the middle was actually land that was owned by the Bishop of Derry. The Church of Ireland Bishop of Derry was one of the largest landowners in northwest Ulster, and the manor of Ardstraw was part of the property owned by the Bishop of Derry. So really focused on the village of Ardstraw itself and the townlands around it. Remember, Ardstraw was a very important place ecclesiastically. It was the seat of the cathedral of what became the Diocese of Derry at one point. It's the burial place of Turlough Leonach O'Neill, the Lord of the O'Neills, who died in 1595. So a place of immense importance. But here we have the pinkish townlands are in the manor of Strabane, the yellow townlands in the manor of Derry Goon or Derry Woon, the two names are used synonymously. Again, let's just zoom in a little bit more. So now we can see a bit more clearly. Newton Stewart, Moyle Glebe, the residence of the rector of Ardstraw, the Mourne River flowing along here, and here we have the Derg coming in to join it. And again, here we have Baronscourt, and here we have Blurgymore, Ballyreenan. I'll talk about more of those in a moment. So there are different sets of maps for the Abercorn estate. This is one example of a lovely set of maps from 1777. The entire estate was mapped out at townland level in 1777 and 1781. The Donegal bit was 1781, the Tyrone portions were 1777. So here we have the townlands of Termaghan and Lisna Tunney, yes. So here we have the Mourne, and here we have these narrower lines represent the division of the townland into farms. And accompanying this map, the map is much bigger than I'm showing you, but on the same sheet we have the list of the tenants with their farms broken down into arable and pasture and meadow or mountain or bog or whatever it might be. So now we can actually plot, you might say, exactly where Andrew McFarlane's farm was. Number 3, his farm was just here. Or a John Hamilton's farm was number 6. The same of Termaghan. We know the names of the farmers. George Allen, property number 5, just here. Okay, so over a very wide area, we can pinpoint exactly where the owners of farms lived. There's an earlier set of maps. I suspect these maps were prepared by William Starrett, who was a map maker and philomath and poet and much else besides in early 18th century Strabane. A blue plaque was erected to his memory, or in memory of him, in, I think, was it November or December 2022 at Strabane Library. So here we have Largymore. In fact, Largymore was the old name for Ballyreenan. And it's really, these maps are wonderful. These are from maybe from the 1730s, something like that. But look at the clusters of cottages. Look at where it says mountain grazing. Ballyreenan market. A mill. There was a mill just here. There's one of the lakes. Here's 2 of the lakes at Baronscourt. 2 of the 3 lochs, Fanny, Catherine, and Mary. And the 3 lakes, there's 2 of them just shown here. Another cluster of cottages or houses, Clachan or whatever, over at Ahafad. Ballyreenan, of course, is important. Another evidence of just how ancient this landscape is. We have the portal tomb here at Ballyreenan. Still surviving today, although it's a bit dilapidated. You can see the 2 portals just here and the large capstone on top. In fact, it's a double portal tomb, which is very unusual. But evidence that people have been living here for thousands and thousands of years. So what I did was I took the Ballyreenan map and I turned it on its side and I tried to link it up as best I could of a modern map of Ballyreenan. And so you can see just how accurate the maps prepared by Starrett actually were. Here, for example, just here is where the mill was located, just on the edge of the golf course. The portal tomb is just here. And if you look at the map, like this is mountainy grazing. So roughly speaking, you can see clearly where there's a division, even on the aerial photograph today, between the more cultivated areas and the more upland areas now covered in forestry. Or if we take this map, this shows 3 townlands, Drumclamp, Mahacregan, and Cavendora. And again, look at the detail in these maps. Mountainy ground, mountainy grazing over here. Look at the number of little place names added to these maps. There's tremendous place name information on these maps, sub-denominational names that have maybe, just maybe, been largely forgotten about today, or maybe still are well known by local farmers. But we find them marked on these maps. Shrubby wood, something called kill walls. Not quite sure what that is, but kill walls. Here we have herd's house. Okay, the man who herded the livestock lived in this particular dwelling. What I did with this map, I put together 3 different maps. So this is Drumclamp. So the previous map, it was actually upside down, so I turned it round so that it's now north to south. I compared it with the 1770 map and compared it with the modern aerial photograph. And so you can see the development of the landscape over the centuries. I mean, even between 1730, say, and 1777, there's been quite a change. I mean, look at this large area here, which is really just considered as mountain. But by this point, the mountain has been pushed back to this area, which still corresponds today. Now, it's not mountain like the Mournes or anything like that, but it's sort of this higher, rougher ground. But look how now, 1730, 1777, what we're talking here about, less than 50 years, how it's much more cultivated than it has been. And you can see that reflected still. The landscape of 1777 is still the landscape, essentially, of 2024. So these maps provide opportunities to explore landscape and to see how landscape has changed and to see the impact of our ancestors have made on the landscape. So the Abercorn papers allow many opportunities to explore numerous different aspects of life over the centuries in this area. And I hope I've given you an insight into that this evening, and thank you very much for listening.